Sunday in Advent. It is based on the scripture from that Sunday. Isaiah 2:2-4. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." And from Matthew 24:36-44. "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour that you do not expect him." Each year, as we celebrate Advent, we are observing a time of waiting and preparation. We are waiting. We have been waiting for a very long time. Ancient Israel waited for the promises of God to be fulfilled. They waited for a time when they would no longer face persecution, and Yahweh's justice and peace would reign there. Similarly, the early Christians waited for the imminent return of the Messiah. I know that each of us has our own vision of what we might be waiting for when the visions described in today's passages are fulfilled. But I'm going to ask you to take a minute and think. Close your eyes, listen to the pipes. Imagine a world. What kind of world do you imagine? I imagine a world where all young girls are given equal access to healthcare and education. I imagine a world where young boys are not trapped in an endless cycle of violence and poverty. I imagine a world where no one goes hungry at night. What kind of world do you imagine? God promises us that Jesus will return, swords will be turned into plowshares, and we will have justice. But we have been waiting a very long time. How much longer must we wait? Women and girls around the globe face gender-based violence and discrimination. We have been waiting. Here in Chicago and all across the country, we suffer from an epidemic of gun violence. We have been waiting. Systematic problems make it difficult for people to break free from their cycle of poverty and injustice. We have been waiting. Today's passage from Matthew presents a pressing view of what it is we have been waiting for when all will be as God has promised. We are told that not even Jesus knows the but he will come like a thief in the night. So we must remain vigilant for the return of Christ. Early Christians could have never imagined that 2,000 years later we would still be waiting. They believed Christ's return would happen in their own lifetime. After such a long time of waiting on God, he had finally sent his son to fulfill the prophetic promises. And then they were expected to wait some more. Last Thursday, the world mourned the death of one of its greatest leaders. In the past few days, a great deal of memorializing has taken place, as it does when someone well-known dies. But I would push that this memorializing sugarcoats the life of Nelson Mandela. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa was much different in many ways from the civil rights movement here. Afrikaners, South Africans of Dutch descent who had been in the country for several hundred years, were in the minority but kept power when the country gained its independence. Afraid of losing their political and economic power and their lives, they slowly instituted a systematic oppression known as apartheid. They divided the country into 4 distinctive classes: the Afrikaners, the Indians, the coloreds, and the blacks. Each was legally required to carry an identity card so that no one could get confused. They all lived separately. Black South Africans, who were the lowest class, could not vote, had little access to health care and education. Beginning in the 1950s, blacks began to organize protests against the South African government, which enforced apartheid laws using brute force on the part of the police. Nelson Mandela became a leader in the African National Congress, an organization banned in 1960 by the South African government that eventually came to use violence in their protests. And although he himself initially advocated nonviolence, the situation became so desperate that he himself believed that if they were to gain their independence and freedom, they might have to take it by force. He was imprisoned for over 27 years on Robben Island with a number of other anti-apartheid leaders. Mandela's situation must have seemed hopeless in so many ways. Imprisoned while the struggle against apartheid became more and more violent, as it involved more and more casualties of innocent lives. He spent 27 years waiting, much of it in isolation, waiting for his people to achieve freedom and know peace in South Africa. During the Middle Ages, an anonymous monk compiled the promises of God that had been fulfilled through Jesus into a chant that became known as the O Antiphons. In a time that we call the Dark Ages, when very few people could read or write or even had access to a Bible, he recorded the prophecies in a hopeful chant which reminded Christians of the promises of God and called for Christ's return. After being handed down through generation to generation, almost 1,000 years later, that Latin text was translated and set to music. We know the song as O Come, Emmanuel. This song and its history remind us of the centuries of Christians who wonder, just as we do, how much longer must we wait? But what are we waiting for? Emmanuel means God with us, and during his time on earth, Jesus was just that. Both Isaiah and Matthew express a deep hope that someday, once again, God will be with us and we will be with God. It is in this longing hope that we celebrate during Advent, a hope for Emmanuel, peace, joy, and love that accompany that promise. But as Jesus is imploring his disciples in Matthew, this hope isn't just about waiting for the kingdom to come, but living in the kingdom now. As people created in the image of God, God lives in us too. Jesus is not in some far-off time, but Jesus is with us now. day becomes a call to embody Christ in the world. We do not know the hour or the day, but while we are waiting, we can make sure that God's love continues to be poured into the world. While we have been waiting on God, God has been waiting on us. What are we waiting for? While the world hopes for peace and justice, how can we become Christ's hope in the world? O come, Emmanuel becomes not just a call for the return of Christ, but a call for us to be Christ. We are to rejoice because Emmanuel is not coming. Emmanuel has come. We have hope in the most unlikely circumstances that God will keep God's promises. Both of our scripture passages for today present the earnest hopes of a people waiting on God. But for Christians, hope is more than just optimism or wishful thinking. Cornell West highlights this distinction well. He says, hope and optimism are different. Optimism tends to be based on the notion that there's enough evidence out there to believe things are going to be better, much more rational, deeply secular, whereas hope looks at the evidence and says, it doesn't look good at all. Doesn't look good at all. Gonna go beyond the evidence to create new possibilities based on visions that become contagious to allow people to engage in heroic actions, always against the odds, no guarantees whatsoever. It is that kind of impossible hope that makes Nelson Mandela's life so powerful. After being imprisoned for 27 years in deplorable conditions, after witnessing and living through horrific violence in his country, when Nelson Mandela was elected president, he became president of all of South Africa. He called for an end to violence. He even invited his own prison guard to his inauguration. He pointed to the police and said, "You, those who have oppressed us, are a police force too. You are a police force of all of South Africa." When he could have called for revenge or retribution, he called for reconciliation. South Africa was crippled socially, politically, and economically. Mandela put down his sword and he picked up a plowshare to cultivate a new, peaceful, multiracial South Africa, a rainbow nation. We live in a world where a peace like that described in Isaiah seems unobtainable. But we are called not just to hope for that future day when Isaiah's prophecy is revealed. We are called to be that hope for others and for ourselves in our world now. God has been waiting.